Termo to Madeline, audio edition, page 88, title chapter, The Winter of 1889. Winters were known for being severe on the Madeline Plains, but every once in a while a winter would hit that showed the true character of the settlers there. Those settlers were hardy, they were tough, and they were stubborn. When a winter like 1889 hit, these characteristics were magnified tenfold. The snow started falling, actually, in 1889. The first heavy blizzard came on December 21st and did not let up until the night of the 22nd. When it was over, there was almost 2 feet of snow on the level, on the flat, and nearly 3 feet in the mountains. But then there was a reprieve for about 2 weeks with only light snow flurries. Slowly, over the next few days, the mail and stage routes were opened up and traffic, sparse though it was, began to move again. Shortly after the first of the year, Albert Anderson, John Williams, and Sam Winninger were called into Susanville on jury duty. They left the plains together in a spring wagon with 2-horse team. Another fellow from Big Valley met them at the stage station in Grasshopper, and the 4 of them continued on into Susanville. By this time the snow had settled and traffic on the roads had beat it down farther. The 4 men made it into town with relative ease, but by the time their stint on the jury was over, the snows had started up again, this time in all seriousness. The blizzard hit on January 15th and did not let up for almost a week, keeping the 4 men pinned down away from their families. Back up on the plains, things were in a serious condition. Roy and Harvey Williams were just boys, hardly to be expected to carry on a man's work. But they were both working frantically, trying to do the work of several men. By the time the snows let up, there was almost 3 feet on the flat, and it measured at 5 feet in the higher elevations. The Williams horses were snowbound, and the boys were trying mightily to get them in. Over at the Whittinger home, things were not so crucial. What livestock they had were already in for the winter, and the Whittinger boys and had things well under control. The Whittinger family was just unconcernedly snowed in. Papa was away in town, but everyone knew he would take care of himself, and there were always people in Susanville willing to help those in need. Conditions at the Anderson home, between the Whittinger and Williams place, were far from satisfactory, however. With Mr. Anderson gone, most of the family sick and down in bed with the flu, and Mrs. Anderson due to have a baby any minute, things were very, very serious. By January 20th, the mail was shut down completely, and all routes of communication were closed. People on the plains took care of each other in those years, though. Louis Whittinger had managed to cover the 1.5 miles of territory between his home and that of the Andersons to check up on them. When he discovered what the situation was like there, he headed on toward the William place. Luckily, he met Roy and Harvey driving a bunch of horses about halfway there and told them the details. Louis turned back for home, and the 2 Williams boys continued onward. When they got home, they told their mother all about it and let her make the decision. There were several good midwives on the plains in those years, including Mona Williams, but her hands were tied. Her youngest son, George, was barely a year old. It would not do for her to go off and leave him or take him to a household where sickness had a firm hold, if she could even get there with such a small baby through all that snow. Mrs. Whittinger was in a similar situation and could be of no help because of the small children she had at home. Isabel Maurer was well known as a midwife and nurse for the sick, but she was almost 10 miles away and high up in the foothills of Mount McDonald. She was a frail woman, and even if a message could be taken to her, it may have been that she could not have withstood the hardship of traveling that far under such trying conditions. It was decided to get a message out to either Mary Pino at her home near Sage Hen or Pamela Smith on the South Fork, but the Pino family was down sick too, so Mrs. Smith was the chosen candidate. Pamela Smith was a highly respected midwife who, by the time her career ended, had 44 babies to her credit. She was an extremely hard woman who already had several children of her own. She had been out in conditions like this before. One time she had almost lost her toes in frostbite when she went out into the Red Rock country to deliver one of Bob Howard's children. However, Howard was the buckaroo boss for Ramsey out of Likely and generally had his camp set up anywhere from Tule Lake to Tuladad. It seemed, though, that when Mrs. Howard was due to have a baby, he always got the family as far out in the Red Rock country as he could. Then he would come a whipping and a spurring to get Mrs. Smith to deliver the newborn. The Howards had 4 children, Mabel, Rudy, Katie, and Harvey, and Mrs. Smith had attended the birth of all of them. When the message got through to her that Mrs. Anderson was in need of her services, John Smith loaded some supplies in a sleigh and hitched up a team. He stayed with the 7 Smith children, and Pamela set out on her own for the Madeline Plains. By this time the snows had stopped, and cold winds were blowing the snow into huge drifts on Sage Hen Flat. But it was frozen, and the sleigh went along at pretty good speed. Roy Williams met her at the base of the hill on Madeline Plains, just about where Madeline is today. He had a small bunch of 8 or 10 horses that he was driving to break a trail. With these horses in the lead, Pamela followed him in the sleigh to the Williams Ranch, arriving only a few hours after dark. The next morning, Roy and Mrs. Smith set out early, Roy driving a fresh bunch of horses to break the trail, and Pamela following on horseback. When they got to the Anderson place that afternoon, Roy quickly headed for home, and Pamela moved in to care for the stricken family. At this time, the 3 menfolk and their partner from Big Valley, who had been on the jury, were making a monumental effort to get home. When the storms had finally stopped, they could see it was useless to try to go anywhere in their spring wagon. So they had done some dealing around town and came up with some borrowed saddles and a couple more horses. They set out at daylight, and first morning, by nightfall, had made it as far as the stone watering trough above Willow Creek. They camped there that night, and the following day they made it as far as the stage station in Grasshopper Valley. After dark and bone-weary after fighting the snow all day, by the next night they were at Whittinger's home. When they learned the conditions at the Anderson home, Albert and John pushed on the extra mile and a half in the dark of night to get there. Things were under control at the Anderson camp. The children were still sick, but Mrs. Smith was nursing them back to good health at a steady pace. Mrs. Anderson still had not had the baby, but was due at any minute. John Williams spent the night there, what was left of it anyway, and then started for home the next morning. At his own camp he found things in pretty good working order. Roy and Harvey had most of the horses in and were feeding them what little hay had been put up. John helped them over the next several days in getting the rest of their animals rounded up and making preparations to move the entire band to George E. Williams' place on the South Fork. A sizable number of livestock had already died on the Madeline Plains, and John Williams was not planning on adding any of his animals to the list. But then more snow came, slowing down the preparations for another week. On top of that, word got through that although the Pino family were all back to normal health, Mrs. Pino was due to deliver a child any day, and Mrs. Smith's services were needed there as soon as possible. Just as soon as the weather was clear enough to make traveling easier, John Williams dispatched Roy to the Anderson home to get Pamela. To accomplish this feat, Roy took another little band of horses to break trail, and while he was gone, John and Harvey set about getting the others ready to move as soon as he got back. When Roy arrived at the Andersons, he could heave a sigh of relief that the Anderson baby had been born in good health, and Mrs. Smith was ready to move out. The family's health had been improved greatly. Once again, she followed Roy and the little bunch of horses floundering through the snow back to the Williams ranch. The next morning, after Roy and Mrs. Smith arrived at the Williams home, they set out on the South Fork Valley. John, Roy, and Harvey drove the entire band of Williams horses in the lead, and Mrs. Smith followed behind in her sleigh, which had been parked at the Williams place all this time. The Williams horses were known for being the meanest horses in the country. They were good horses once they were finally broke, but it was getting them to that point that required horse breakers equally as mean and ornery. It was a good thing at this point that they were so cantankerous. Otherwise, they would have never been able to plow through that kind of snow all the way to South Fork. The little group and their horses made it to Pino's that first night. Pamela moved in to prepare the birth which was soon to take place, but John Williams and his 2 boys left early the next morning to try to get their horses on over Sage Hen and into Likely. The going was rough and starting slow for the first 2-3 miles. The wind came up and began to lash the snow against them. The snow's depth had decreased some along about Dry Creek, and they were able to speed their progression some. Once they got off the wind-swept hill, however, the depth increased again. By the time they pulled into Williams' place on the South Fork several hours after dark, they were going over the tops of the wire fences and never even knowing the difference. The next morning, when they went out to the corrals to check on their horses, they found that half a dozen big colts that had been in the band the day before were missing. They went back and tried to find where they had lost them in the dark and the blowing snow, but could find no tracks. It was not until well into March, when things had begun to rapidly thaw and the melting snow on the Madeline plains had turned it into a lake over 15 miles long and 9 miles wide. It was discovered when the colts and where they had gone. That night at South Fork they had wallowed, totally exhausted, to the far side of the corral and laid down to rest. The fiercely blowing winds had covered them in a drift that also covered the top of the Stockdale corral. There they had found the rest they wanted, only permanent. Back at the Pino camp, Mrs. Smith stayed on until she delivered the new daughter, Mary, named after her mother, Mrs. Pino. Then she headed home. By then the trail to the South Fork was somewhat improved. After the Williams horses had gone through, work was started to keep the trail open and the mail and the stage from Amity. It was still an all-day journey for the little lady and her team and sleigh. Back at South Fork, just 8 days after delivering Mary Pino's, Pamela Smith gave birth to a new daughter, Bertha. And as the same Bertha would say some 92 years later, quote, "Now I call that really pioneering, wouldn't you?" Unquote. Next chapter, titled Schoolhouse Point, page 93.